Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen. Episode 38, Teaching Rhythms over Other Rhythms.
So, Eric, I wanted to talk about today something inside the rhythm learning sequence that I haven't really heard discussed, but it seems eminently practical when you're teaching, especially instrumental students. I'm thinking guitar and drums and piano, but I think the skill is retained even for singers. It's something a singer has to learn to do. So if we look at how people go through the rhythm learning sequence and how it's described by Gordon, if you look at the very first step that you would take with someone who is really challenged rhythmically and they were learning rhythm patterns, it does seem easier to get people to audiate microbeats first and then put a macro beat on top of the microbeats rather than do it the other way around, trying to get them to hold a macro beat. And I found that instrumentally for years before I even found Gordon. I discovered that as well. But the issue that I have in terms of the way the rhythm learning sequence is described, every time you learn a new piece of rhythmic content in terms of a rhythm pattern, so just down the sequence, like he says, I have no problem with the order. We're considering it as one piece of rhythmic the content that's being held in the meter. So, for example, if I learn a new rhythm pattern in duple, Gordon's assuming I'm actually audiating duple when I learn the rhythm content. Now, that's great. I have no problem with that. But one thing he doesn't talk about is the systematic structure of learning how to audiate more than one rhythm at a time. Because I think there actually is a logical structure to this. So, for example, learning how to audiate two distinct rhythmic voices at the same time. This is different than just learning how to audiate new rhythm content in a meter you're familiar with. It requires a different sequence of unrolling things. So, for example, the very first step of this, I think, is in his writing of audiating meter is audiating microbeats and macrobeats at the same time. But then you can make actual melodic rhythm out of those two patterns, right?
Sure.
So let's say, for example, we're in duple and you're only allowed to play microbeats and macrobeats in different combinations of two voices. That is a certain skill that someone has to learn in audiation-based way, but also physically on their instrument, which is a whole nother reason to do this. If you take people through these combinations on a piano or a guitar or drums, they start excelling rather rapidly at those instruments, because what do those instruments persist of? Playing multiple voices at the same time. So all I'm saying is that as an outgrowth to what Gordon has laid out, there's a logical structure to learning how to audiate two or three or whatever voices at the same time. I think it's probably diminishing returns after a while, but at least learning how to audiate two and three voices. And so what I've been doing with students on the guitar is just making little, they're not even songs, right? It's more like an LSA in kind of my street LSA, where they're learning some kind of skill through induction. I'm giving them a listened example, and they're playing it on their instrument. But I've noticed one really interesting thing, and we were talking off air about this, is that the students that I have that can do this really well on the guitar and the piano, they can improvise really well on those instruments. There seems to be a really high correlation between their total improv ability and their ability to play multiple rhythms at the same time. So that's kind of what I was thinking about while I was on vacation as kind of a springboard for conversation. That's my vacation, cup of coffee.
Yeah. Well, we were talking as usual for about an hour before we started this conversation, and it's amazing that I've kind of been on the same track, but not just considering two rhythm patterns at the same time. But I've been working myself at doing two meters at the same time.
Sure.
2 against 3 and 3 against 4, just trying to get them comfortable in my body, back and forth. And I haven't gotten real far because I just don't have the listening vocabulary for it. And I think so there's a whole missing for me there. But So but this opens up a whole new realm of possibility. So let's just go back to exactly what Gordon does. It's like you learn to move with meter when you're little, and when you're ready, you or you learn to move to the microbeat, learn to move to the macrobeat, and that coordinates your body.
Which those, just to interrupt for one sec, those can actually be considered two rhythmic voices.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. Right?
Yes. Yes.
So those are actual two voices that could exist as melodies.
I try to get that in the child's body, if not at the same time, that they go back and forth, that they can do, and they can also do day, just in movement. And then I do, obviously, half notes and phrases, and anything. We jump every 4 measures sometimes.
Which is interesting. You can highlight those same jumps, like you're doing it in a physical kinesthetic way. You can highlight it with changes of harmony, which is really cool. Right?
That's
it's the same thing. That's why it's useful to have a physical kinesthetic, like I'm auditing microbeat and macrobeat, but every 4 bars I jump, right? Because that's what's going to happen later with harmonic rhythm.
Yeah, and they're not thinking. I'm just jump, and I've got recorded music going on in the background. And then I go back to the stuff that they're supposed to have already in their body. I like doing little beats on their chest, and macro beats, swaying left foot to right foot. That's one of the easier ones. Or easier yet is to do micro beats in the mouth and the macro beats in their legs.
Yep.
And arms are better than legs early on, so there's even easier. Do and they do ba 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 ba. So that's even easier. So thinking about the coordination sequence on top of the getting meter in the body
requires a type of coordination for sure.
Yeah, getting meter in the body before you teach rhythm patterns. Now, so we teach this rhythm pattern, and they can echo it back, right? And they've got a whole variety of other rhythm patterns that they can echo back, individually. And so they're ready for more rhythm patterns or another meter, like that. But what I hear you saying is, all right, so I'm going to, this melodic rhythm pattern,
it could be melodic rhythm. I think,
or it could be a macro beat. That's just basic, right? So,
or a subdivision or whatever.
So get half the class to do ba ba ba, and get the other half ba 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 ba, and switch. That would be 2 patterns at the same time.
The only problem with that is that if you were a student in that experience, so you can audiate the meter, you can audiate the rhythm pattern, or the melodic rhythm, whatever it is, and you're on one half of the class that's doing rhythm pattern A, and the other half of the class is doing B, just because they're both being played in the room at the same time and you're playing one, doesn't truly mean you're audiating the second one yourself. The class as a unit might be. Like if you think the class is like a social music brain, but the individual in that case might not be audiating both of the rhythms.
Right? So we need to find a way to do 2 rhythm patterns at the same time within the same child.
So, and the way that you do that is exactly what we've been talking about. You need a piano, a guitar, something like that, or you do body drumming and singing.
Yep.
Yeah, it has to be some kind of kinesthetic thing because you have to have some concrete way of actually performing the rhythm pattern before the audiation of that can be purely mental and conceptual. There needs to be some kind of physical unit of that, whether it's singing and stomping or guitaring with a right hand and a left hand. There has to be multiple things going on.
So ba 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 ba. It's like that, something like that.
So that's exactly what I'm talking about. And all I'm claiming here, and this should seem obvious if you just take the logic through, is that there's gonna be an organization of those tasks that goes from easy to difficult, and there's going to be an organization of those tasks that supports more rapid learning of them. That's all I'm saying.
So take a melodic rhythm, right? And any rhythm that doesn't have just macro and micro beats in it is a melodic rhythm, right? So, any combination, right?
So you could,
and then do that with micro beats first, macro beats second, and then a pattern of micro beats and macro beats together.
Exactly.
And then a pattern with, macro
Divisions,
beats and then back, instead of macro first, micro second, do that, and then go.
So hold on, I want to highlight something you said, because when you start thinking, okay, let's say we have melodic rhythm. I'm just repeating what you said. We have melodic rhythm, and now we're going to put micro beats behind it. And we have melodic rhythm, same one. Now we're going to put macro beats. Now third, melodic rhythm. Now we're going to make phrases where we order those differently. That structure there, where you just ended on, where you're starting to make patterns of those different things, that's what melodic rhythm is. It's the systematic. It's some kind of pattern making out of some kind of rhythmic division, not division in the sense of a subdivision, but some kind of rhythmic division. It's using multiple different patterns in probably logical structures itself, and that's another angle that people I think struggle with improv, is that it's one thing to improv with straight microbeats, straight macrobeats, but it takes another kind of processing to actually start combining the two in intelligible ways, and that's what making a phrase is, right? That's what making an actual phrase is, the combinations of those things. But I think what you're saying is that you would logically still do it in some kind of order. You'd learn how to do micro and macro over a melodic rhythm, because we're talking about doing all of this over another rhythm pattern, like an actual melodic rhythm. But it's really interesting. Like, you can see all the tendrils that start coming out of this right away. Like, how many ways there are to go about this.
Insane number of permutations. You can't even think about it. And we're just talking about a simple macro, micro.
So this is how I've been practicing scales. I just put I put something in the right hand. Like, I'll just improvise a melody, and I'll actually do the scale in the left hand of the piano in microbeats, in macrobeats, in different rhythm patterns, and then eventually in its own melodic rhythm. But I think that's actually, in terms of complexity, once you have two voices and you can audiate all these rhythm patterns, where this takes you in complexity is that you could fully improvise two separate melodic rhythm patterns. Which
you know who's really good at this? Oh, sorry.
So that's where this goes, is that if you look at this and then look at Bach and look at Mozart, this was the game they were playing. That's what they were doing, is they were just what am I learning right now? I'm learning one of Bach's loop pieces, on classical guitar, and you can see the whole piece. It's 64 bars long. It's metrically perfectly set up. It's in triple, but there's two rhythm patterns that are used in the whole song. The only time you don't use those rhythm patterns, and they're two macro beat patterns, so they're like a micro melodic rhythm. They're still not one pattern, but sometimes it's one, sometimes it's one plus a macro beat. That's the only license he takes, is that sometimes he adds an extra macro beat to resolve a phrase, but he'll stay pretty strict with the I'm only using these two patterns plus maybe some very general exceptions. And you can see that once this is set up, what he's doing compositionally is trying to choose which hand or which voice should be playing which pattern, whether they should be the same or different, and what structures they should come in. And then on top of that, how can the harmony help highlight the changes that I'm making? Man, that's fun.
We got to slow down. There's a lot. There's so much in what you're saying.
There is a lot there, but let's go over that. What compositionally or improv wise do you think is blocking people from doing that?
I just remember, here's my flashback is learning, two-part invention number one, and how hard it was for me to get my two hands to be independent.
It's insane.
Because I was never taught to put two rhythm patterns together, really, not at that level, compared to, here's a whole note in the left hand and I got two half notes up here in the right hand. When you're in your first year of piano lesson, second year, you're playing a chord and you're playing melodies over it, and eventually you get up to where you're playing solfeggietto and and Für Elise, of course, and Clementi and like that, and they seem to fit homophonically together more than they are.
That's what's cool about it,
right? So it's more homophonic than it is, two melodies, polyphonic.
Yes.
So and then, but there's always some polyphony and homophony and vice versa.
Yeah, you can tell. I mean, I think about this in my mind as two different types of composing. The one type is improvised or composed where it's a central melody that's leading the whole composition.
Yeah.
And the accompaniment is really just there to highlight the meter and the harmony. It's not actually doing much else on its own. Yeah. But then there's another, and we're basically talking about counterpoint here.
Yeah.
Is that counterpoint is how do you make the second voice or the other voices not only provide the same benefit that accompaniment does in terms of highlighting the meter and highlighting the harmonic changes, which is the whole damn point of the accompaniment. How do you do that while also making it sound like that other voice is its own melodic unit? Right?
Yeah.
It's really cool because, I mean, this it seems like if you look at how counterpoint was learned, like this perfectly lines up in terms of, first you learn two notes at once, then one against two, then one against three, then one against four, two on two.
There's got to be
three on four.
Yeah, there's got to be an easier way to get somebody ready to do, two hands that are separate melodies.
Yeah, there has to be some time spent in the lesson actually learning these skills. So, that's what you're saying. It's hilarious.
I figured it out somehow. I don't, it's like...
Yeah.
Eventually you can audiate the two parts together, not just the rhythms. So what about tonally? The same thing. That's another episode probably, but to be able to...
The tonality, this is really interesting, but the tonality, like the changes in tonality, the changes in harmony, and the changes in keyality, those things are in the tonal, basket of this. But depending on the change, because basically when we're talking about harmony, we have to at some point talk about one harmony going to another, or one tonality going to another, or one keyality going to another. It has to happen in time. And what's the time dimension? It's rhythm. So like the changes in harmony and rhythm, the changes in harmony can actually highlight the changes that are happening in rhythm, because it's another thing to say, wow, that happened on time.
Layer that after you've got the rhythm. And it's no accident that it's the same, thing that who said, just think of a rhythm and play notes over it. Dizzy Gillespie, right? So, like, rhythm comes first. It seems like it's more fundamental. Gordon said the same thing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you look at...
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think you just need more basic rhythm patterns that fit with other basic rhythm patterns, or the same rhythm pattern juxtaposed over the third beat versus the first beat. Maybe that's easier. This is, ba 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 ba. So ba ba ba.
What's interesting about that though is the intuition that you had to try that was like purely that was a concept, right? In the most in a classical definition of concept, not the way Gordon defines conceptual and stuff like that, but like it was something that you didn't necessarily audiate before you thought of trying.
Yeah.
But you had reached a proficiency in the audiation kind of absorption level of these tonal patterns and rhythm patterns to actually make an educated kind of guess at trying that. Well, let's push this back one macro beat. Yeah. Which is where this leads, I think, eventually.
Yeah, or just a measure. So, whatever's the thing is now we need to find out what's easier, and it might be easier to do something displaced by a measure in one case, and something displaced by, a half a measure in another case, or displaced. Of course, starting with microbeats, macrobeats should be easy. And then a macro beat pattern
This is
But
why I
then
love I love intro classical guitar like books, like the old school ones, because what were they consisted of? It was all songs at the beginning that were with microbeats. There's just a ton of songs in triple and in duple, all microbeats, the whole piece, all major, all minor at first. And then some of the good ones would have, you know, some random Dorian pieces and Lydian pieces in there and stuff like that. But that was the training at first. And then what happens after you have a bunch of pieces with microbeats and macrobeats, they start getting syncopated. The melodies will naturally syncopate in terms of the upbeats in duple being accented and stuff like that. And then it makes it easier to learn, you know, eventually the next, going through the rhythm learning content, like all the content of elongations and all that. The elongations actually don't sound that weird once you've been playing a ton of syncopated stuff, because there's a way you can kind of look at those as the same thing. But it's really cool to think of this stuff, because I think instrumentally it can be so powerful to take people through this. Like if you teach piano and, you know, you just say like, okay, D and A with the left hand back and forth. Now we're going to do all this. We're going to do the tonal patterns we've learned in microbeats over it or whatever. And this stuff just sounds like Mozart in a box. Like you get someone to do this, and within a minute, they almost start like getting excited because it starts really coming to life. And that is just covering all the bases. It's music that's made with really good awareness of meter. And then the harmony stuff is so fun to play with on top of this. Like I've been doing this instead of doing actual work with harmony. I just say, okay, here's the meter. You have to use microbeats in, you know, on this string on the guitar. You have to use a macrobeat on this string. Now improvise through the changes of like Stella or Autumn Leaves or whatever piece you want, or just whatever harmony you want. It makes the harmonic stuff fun to experiment with. A lot of fun because it has some kind of rhythmic backdrop into it. Yeah, and I think for this reason, the piano is a monster of an instrument to do this stuff on. It's like on a guitar, you can do this with inexperienced guitar players by like splitting voices up into different strings, but at a certain point, you can't unleash the guitar's full potential without a ton of training, technically. But piano-wise, I can tell someone to play like 3 against 1 or 4 against 1, like really soon. Like there's not a big technical. Obviously, piano technique is art in itself.
Bilateral. But it's easier with bilateral.
But I mean, I essentially could teach someone with only 2 index fingers to do this.
Yeah. Yep.
And they can, you know, bring it to life really quick. And that's kind of what I've done with beginning students that they're struggling. Like they come to me for piano lessons and like, I want to play piano. And I can't really say like, for me, I haven't gone this direction, but I don't say like, we're not starting piano until you've like sang for a year. Because, you know, they're at my doorstep, like ready to learn piano. So I just start teaching them these songs that are only microbeats on the piano. And a lot of it is not based off of like, they're not singing when they first see me. But why does that work? You know, because I've always claimed on this podcast that people learn to audiate on their guitar without singing or on their keyboard without singing. Like, how is that possible? Like, based off of everything we know. And
they're using the piano as, you know, oral, or their guitars are oral, or, you know, as a, you know, they're able, on instruments, they're able to explore more.
Exactly.
And there's a creativity in a play that like, you're doing that right, you're doing this wrong. No, just give them skills to... And
I do the things that you do, where I play with the 5 chord and the 1 chord resolving a lot. So by like their sense of tonality gets really refined.
There's
from
no
just listening
directions
to
that come with blocks, right? You don't have directions. If you need directions, that might not be the place to start. The emphasis on play is so underrated, like all the way up through adulthood.
I agree, and this is one of the things I've noticed with really good teachers of improv, or just actually good teachers of beginning students. Like the way we've talked about Paul Harris a lot on this, but Paul Harris will set his student up with an exercise like that. Like, let's just play triplets with B flat major chords and improvise over it. And they'll just explore that. And it's like, it's simple enough to do that people can kind of practice it. You know, it's not like, well, I have to listen to like 10,000 hours of music, and one day I'll just start spontaneously inventing melodies, which you will if you consume enough music. But this is like instrumentally a very safe and practical way to explore things with people. Like if they have a basic rhythm achievement level and they can play microbeats and macrobeats, holy smokes, like you can turn them into really decent sounding piano players within like a month or two for a lot of students. Like really young students, maybe not, but like if a teenager comes to me and they have achieved the ability to play, you know, microbeat and macrobeat with their hands on their lap, like you can turn them into a decent piano player quite quickly. And it's exciting for them because you just teach them these really wide arpeggios in meter, and they sound, you know, pretty good.
Yeah,
like
young kids want that success right away, and help them discover something that they can invent for themselves while they're playing. And of course you give them stuff to practice, but just think about just giving them an extra block to build with. These are cool blocks, and you let them, so they have more chance to experiment with these two rhythm patterns at the same time, whether it's microbeat, macrobeat patterns, or combinations of those with two melodies, or even the same melody. That's what a two-part invention is. It's the same melody reoccurring later. It opens a huge door for research again of what's the easier, what's easiest, what's moderately difficult, what's difficult, and then
well, it goes without saying they can't do it, like they're not going to be able to do multiple like different rhythm patterns together unless they can do the new
stuff before.
The easier stuff first. So can you audiate the macrobeat and microbeat with the new rhythm pattern, like the subdivision or whatever? So you can kind of tell when someone's even ready to try putting two of these together, because they have to have achieved the level where they can audiate the rhythm patterns before they start combining them.
Sure, there's a.
But I still think the combination has a sequence to it.
But I think there would be a huge amount of benefit to find out whether, starting on an upbeat, da da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee, about that, whether that's easier than something that starts on the beat but in a different pattern, da da dee da da dum 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 da da dee da 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 dum, right? So at some point it's like, score study,
This is what I started doing with Mozart. So I've been listening to Mozart's piano sonatas, and what I did is I just I've been doing this by ear, but you can do this just as well with the sheet music if you can notationally audiate. But you just look at the rhythm patterns that he's putting against each other, and how not just the rhythm patterns themselves as like the individual microbeat or four macrobeat patterns, but the actual repeating structures of them. Because you can say, well, he did microbeats in one hand, macrobeat for a few, like say 2 times, and then there was a new rhythm pattern 2 times, and there's this superstructure that starts showing up of how they're even arranging this stuff, and it starts just getting really logical. Like everything is like, wow, like Mozart has this peculiar ability to be really tough to play and harmonically advanced and rhythmically advanced, but it's so listenable by the naive musician, like just a beginning musician who doesn't have like a superhuman amount of music achievement can almost instantly understand Mozart, because it's just so obvious the way things are laid out. Like the melodies are, usually in coherent phrase structures, and sometimes there's an extra bar or 2 bars at the end of something.
So I'm wondering if it might not be easier to be putting these rhythm patterns together to wait until you can notationally audiate. And you're never reading anything that's unusual or unfamiliar?
I think the notational audiation part of this can make that side of the structuring easy to see, because we're essentially talking about counting things, right? And so what's interesting about this, and we were
I don't use the word counting around.
I know that's a trigger word in this, but like here's what I mean about that is that we're talking about this before, but audiation exists like on a perceptual level. So like your own mind is producing the internal conscious experience of audiating. That's that.
Yeah.
But then concepts are an entirely different thing. Concepts are not related to that, but can influence that sphere at some level. So what I mean by this is when I'm saying that rhythm patterns show up in structures, and those structures are actually what make musical phrases and melodic rhythm phrases, whether they're 8-bar long or whatever, 16-bar long, that can be perceived at a perceptual level without any concepts. And I mean, Gordon's been saying that the whole time. That's his whole rail against theoretical understanding is that. But the way Gordon defines theoretical understanding and concepts is not how philosophers typically talk about it. So I have nothing wrong with what he says. Just they use different words for the same thing. But concept in this case, there's a valid concept of an audiated piece of information. So, for example, if you can audiate certain rhythm patterns, what I'm getting at is that counting is not necessarily evil to audiation. Counting can influence the way you improvise and compose. So, like, we were talking about Charles Limb and how improvisers need to let their subconscious take over, or the improv basically sucks, right? I mean, but what I'm talking about here is like your subconscious is still counting just because you're not conceptually consciously counting.
I think you can become a brilliant musician without any counting at all. You know, so I agree with you. The feeling of rhythm is so much more important.
But the feeling of rhythm, like when we talk about feeling a phrase structure, like when you play the blues and you know it's going to go back to bar one, you don't you conceptually know that now, like, which is good.
Well, no, I probably conceptually knew it before I felt it, but now I feel it. I don't. Okay,
that's a bad example. I'm talking about one, like a musical change that you only learned first purely by perception. All I'm saying is that the reason you feel like there's a one chord coming is because of some kind of musical, like audiated perceptual counting that's going on in the background. But
the end product, not as an end.
But there's a difference in being conscious of counting, because when you're conscious of counting, you could say, well, there's 2 phrases there, and that's the same as the number 2 I'm writing down. That's a different process. But like when you are actually listening to music and you feel that the phrases are 8 bars long or 16 bars long, there's a type of like sub-perceptual counting that's going on that you're not really have access to.
Well, that's what I call the feel more than it's
yeah,
not a counting thing. It is a trigger, but there's also that rhythm. If it's counted, you lose the weight and flow of the thing.
You're talking about,
on the other hand, when
you're talking about if it's conceptually counted, in terms of like you actually are assigning mental numbers to it.
Yeah, I just don't use numbers and never have.
But what I'm saying is that it's still perceptually organized, and there's a type of counting involved in that. Like when you're in the perceptual organizing is happening, like say in the meter of Duple, So how many songs in Duple have phrases that are 8 bars long or 16 bars long? There's a type of organization that's going on there, whether you know it or not.
Yeah, no. Assigning numbers to certain things after you're audiating is fine. We can go down this hole. We'll go down the same hole that we did with pitch letter names. And we'll come out together somewhere down the road, but let's not get bogged down there. This is such a fascinating idea of learning rhythm patterns in conjunction with other rhythm patterns, such that you're developing a more sophisticated vocabulary of melodies going together.
Exactly.
Before you put melodies together, we're assuming too tonally that those melodies that might go together would be in the same tonality, but then you've got Charles Ives and whoever else likes to do multi-tonal and multi-key.
This reminds me of I was talking about Mike Longo earlier, like Dizzy Gillespie's piano player. So he noticed that this issue with people was that they don't have good rhythm, and one of the things that he would do is he would teach people these certain rhythms on congas or bongo drums or whatever, and his advice to jazz musicians was like, play these different rhythms for like 20 minutes before you go on stage, and you'll tend to just find your improvising is better because it's actually being thrusted by some kind of rhythmic invention at the heart of it. But I think something similar happens here, where if you practice these different rhythm patterns against each other in different structures and different orders, you actually tend to make just better melodies off the top of your head. Like, you think that wouldn't be associated with just like whistling cool melodies off the top of your head when you're not thinking of multiple rhythm patterns being played at once, but does seem to affect it somehow, like quite strongly. Because I noticed my single note improvising on the guitar is much more rhythmically precise and harmonically accurate after I play around with these other things, like putting these rhythm patterns next to each other.
Yeah, I need to correct what I said. It's polykeel and polytonal because they're happening at the same time, not multi. Multi is like it changes somewhere in the piece and goes back or whatever. And
what was the name of the polymetric music you were showing me?
Oh, the Konnakol, the Indian Indian tabla language.
Yeah, we should put a link to one of them.
Where each sound is represented by a syllable. Ta is different than din, ta different than da, ta, din, na. And then those are different places to hit on the tabla. Two drums, one's the tabla, one's called something else. But the set is also called tabla. But look up YouTube videos. Konnokol, I think. There's
maybe we'll put a link to one of them.
This one that's 75/16. And it's so cool. You can actually watch how they're counting it. So, and how they count it is physically on their hands.
That makes perfect sense.
With claps and finger taps.
Yeah, so I'm not totally sure how they do this, but I'm assuming they have some system because there's like 4 or 5 meters going on at once. So I'm assuming they use some kind of.
It's a string of meters that are they're not happening simultaneously.
Oh, they're not actually. Oh, so they're going from like 5.2 to like 5.8 to like 5.16.
How they don't think of it that way at all. They just learn the patterns.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, and and the language is so critical. The verbal associate is so critical to their rhythmic development, which is astonishing. It's just astonishing to me. If I were left on an island all by myself, what album would I take? What instrument? It would be tabla.
Yeah,
they spend really 2 years perfecting a sound sometimes before they move on.
It's like a type of, it almost sounds like a type of monastic training.
Well, it is. And in traditional tabla, there's players that are the firstborn male of each family has, descended from the king of Persia back in the 14th century or somewhere. And that has maintained. Right, and Zakir Hussain, who's this, is beyond impossible as a child prodigy. He no longer accepted by the classical Indian community because he's gone outside the tradition of classical Indian. So he's basically banished from that high order of. Which is
might not really care though if he was kind of the pinnacle of the hierarchy though, right? Like,
he's more of a pinnacle if he can. Yeah, no, it's just insane. Zakir Hussain. We'll put some links in of some of these videos, and it's just too much. In fact, the group he played with John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin went and studied in India for a while, and. Well after he did his Mahavishnu orchestra stuff, but they played together in a group called Shakti, it's John McLaughlin with Shakti. So there's classical Indian violin type playing. It's all based in classical Indian, the tabla, the violin, and then McLaughlin. And there's another percussion instrument. It's basically a clay pot. And I'm not sure what else I'm forgetting. It's this stuff is phenomenal. I started listening to it when I was student teaching, and now it's coming. There's a tour that's coming around in 23. So I gotta find out where it is, and I'm gonna be traveling if I don't have anything close by, like Washington or Philadelphia. I'm gonna go find.
That's really cool.
It's great. I've seen them before. Zakir Hussain and oh my gosh.
Yeah, Hussein I'm decently familiar with. I just haven't done a deep dive into actually listening to him a lot, but his name is everywhere.
Yeah, I got into it back, it was back when I first met Dr. Gordon. That's when I started looking at, they had some transcripts in the library, the music education library. They had some cassette tapes, and I'd take them home and listen to them and look at the transcripts, and I was just flabbergasted. I had no clue what I was getting into, but it opened a window, and I couldn't audiate any of it really, but it gave me I was fascinated is what it was, and I started listening to traditional Indian music. And then when I ran into groups that were using that, beyond Oregon used tabla and sitar, and of course the Beatles did famously, but that's just trivial, not trivial in terms of how it affected the cross-cultural landscape of music, but trivial in terms of the capacity of what Indian music was, the ragas and the talas, and how does that see, that's beyond me in my lifetime, is how do you get traditional Indian teaching and synthesize that with music learning theory. You look at the product and you just can't ignore that whatever they're doing works.
That's what I was going to say, is that, it seems like at this point, if you had your choice and you were interested in someone developing rhythmically, they seem like they know what they're doing at some level. So.
Yeah, the greatest musicians tend to go over there and study for a while. It's insane. John McLaughlin went over. He's mastered so much on a guitar.
It is funny though how well it.
And he went there.
Yeah, it's just interesting. You kind of hinted at this earlier, but I wanted to bring it up again. The verbal associates that they use are not necessarily beat function syllables, but they are verbal associates, and they're
verbal associates to the tone that you want from the drum. So da is a particular strike of one of the drums, and the din is this particular strike.
But in a lot of the videos you were showing me, people were verbalizing this in how they were actually chanting it. Yeah. Like they were chanting these syllables they're
chanting the syllables, and each syllable is a strike of the drum, and a particular kind of strike. And there's left and right hand, and the edges and the middle and the
what's cool about that though is like that those syllables are meant to represent the sounds that you use, but the syllables themselves make the voice a certain kind of percussion instrument when you actually just verbally speak them, because it makes it sound, because the syllables literally sound different when you say them, and these people who are watching the chanting, it turns into this own type of chanting instrument because they use these certain syllables,
and they keep time keep phrases on their hand with the claps and the finger taps, da, din, din, da, da, ba, da, di, da,
that was cool.
It's nuts, the language, but you mastered the language, that's as important, or you've got to master the language, so you got to be able to say it and sing it or whatever before you play it. So if you're playing these drums, you've got to be able to master the verbal associates ahead of the technique that you need for the drum, to play these things.
Which, that itself kind of lines up with everything that Gordon was talking about, like someone having audiation preparedness before they move to an instrument.
Well, you think about it. What's the best way to learn? You just take a master, and then you're a 5-year-old kid, and you just study that master until he dies.
Yeah.
And part of being a student of those traditional classical Indian musicians is that you would do everything for them. You wash their clothes, you clean their house, you do all this. But then, so you're living a lifestyle. That's the way traditional.
I mean, we've had that apprenticeship system with other musical cultures too. Like there's been composers that have spent that much time with their teachers, or jazz musicians especially have done the apprenticeship thing, because while you're on tour, like you don't live at home. You're living with, whoever you're trying to learn from. But it's a different, obviously different in terms of the way it's set up in classical Indian tradition.
Mastery only comes living inside the master's life. Master's life is what is what you're after. You're after it's almost a religious training, or it is as fundamental as a religious training.
Yeah, for sure.
In that one, like studying in the Buddhist tradition or like that, you learn from the guru or the sheik or whoever.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about musical monks at this point. That's what you're basically getting.
Yeah, yes, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, which is interesting, such variety in the ways people participate in music culturally, whether it's, once a week lesson with a random teacher or a whole, full-blown spiritual tradition around.
Cool. How many students can you take care of? One. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and now it's a whole tradition over there. And it's really extraordinary when you juxtapose it with music learning theory. I don't think you'll see any flaws.
Yeah, no, it's cool. I mean, verbal associates. I find that really interesting.
Yeah,
instead of just making
associates are the way to hone your vocabulary and expand. Without verbal associates, you can't expand your vocabulary. In fact, if we didn't have names for the things in the room, we wouldn't be able to remember stuff.
I mean, that's that's basically what we say when we say that music exists at a perceptual level. The names actually influence the way the perception is experienced. So like, yes. If I give you concepts, the concept is impenetrable to that. The concept stays in the conceptual framework. It might be a valid concept, but the verbal associate actually changes the structure of your experience, which is, I mean, that's why it's important to do.
Yeah, you give somebody who hasn't had experience of a book ever, and they're Aboriginal, somebody who's not had much contact with Western civilization at all, or whatever you want to call. But they, what's a book? A book is many things to them.
For sure.
More than there's to us.
There's something related to this whole topic that's been in the back of my mind. I wanted to bring this up. So, like, have you heard about this, like, crow epistemology idea?
Crow, like the Indian tribe?
No, just like the animal.
The animal, okay.
Okay,
yeah.
So there's an interesting parallel in how we perceive things and how crows do at some level. So, like, if you have a crow and, there's a building and 3 people walk into the building and 2 people walk out, the crow intuitively knows there's still one person in the building, but it's not conceptually counting. It knows this at a perceptual level, that there's not the same amount.
Yeah.
So this is what I was kind of getting at before. But if you put 5 people in a building, the crow watches 5 people walk into a building and 4 walk out, the crow can't discriminate. The crow thinks, well, they all left. And so what this proves is that crows have kind of a limit of how many items their perception can count intuitively. So they can't, once it gets above 4 or 5, they just think, well, that's a lot. But once it's under a certain, but what I think is a similar thing happens to us musically. And this is like why Mozart is easy to listen to, because the patterns come at you in really easy, digestible chunks. But when something like, for example, with this Indian music we're talking about, the 75/16 meter, like, I don't care who you are, you're not audiating that unless you know how to count it, or you know the verbal associates. Like,
Yeah,
it would take you like a conceptual framework to even figure that out, because the limit of our natural ability to audiate a meter like that is, I don't think, I think it's similar to the crow not being able to naturally audiate past 4 or 5.
I think I could. If I spent a couple months, I think I could figure out how to get it. I think I could do it.
Yeah, but my claim though, hold on. Let's rewind for a sec. My claim though is the reason you could drill that into your mind through oral is that at some sub-perceptual level, your brain is organizing things and thereby has to logically be counting.
Yes.
But it's not a counting. It's not the same counting that you're talking about.
Yes,
it's not like, okay, kids,
I got you.
4 4 is 1 2 3 4.
Right. It would start there and get into my body. But you're right. And how I would do it is by really, really understanding. The linchpin for me is watching their hands and learning to do what their hands are doing and not worrying about the... so I would be putting that movement together with... with just the listening. So I would just...
But see, I'm on the same side as you, because what I'm saying is that this sub-perceptual organization, like this counting with the lowercase c, we can just strike counting if you don't like it. But it's logical.
I'm with you. It's a general... Yeah.
But that is actually more important than conceptually learning to count it.
Yep.
Consciously. So actually saying 1 2 3 4 and trying to lead the wagon with this conceptual organization, it just doesn't work the same way, because it's essentially just a totally different way of perceiving music. Mm-hmm. And actually a conceptual perception of music is an oxymoron, because it doesn't make sense. You can't perceive music conceptually. It has to be experienced as music.
Yes. Can I go back to the crow?
You can go back
this
to
is incredible, because I saw this on public TV.
Okay.
So there's a guy that wears a mask, and he walks through a campus.
I've seen this.
At a college.
Yeah.
And the crows are like, alert, 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 because they know this guy, he's done something at some point where he's pissed off the crows. And so... And then a generation of crows. So the crows know, and they can talk to each other, and so that happens. And then after a generation of crows, somehow they pass down that knowledge. So it's like there's no crows that learned that from the man going into the building or crossing campus. They learned that from a parent teaching them. And there's no crows that knew this man, and now their offspring or offspring's offspring. That guy goes through the campus, and those crows go nuts.
I mean,
and have the same response.
The crows have language, right?
Yeah. So the crows are teaching their baby crows, and the baby crows are teaching their baby crows, that this guy is a terrorist of crows. Leave him alone.
What's cool about that is that it proves a couple of things about crow brains, and this is probably the deepest we've ever gone here. But it proves that crows actually have some kind of mapping of reality. Like there's an entity there, and this entity has the characteristic that I don't trust it, and then it can turn that into some kind of knowledge and share it with other crows.
Yeah,
That's
they
insane.
They definitely have some mapping of language. And it's beyond what you've had to do to teach Coco the gorilla, who learned to speak and make sense, not just repeat, but to think and create his own. But anyway, we can go. So this epistemological context for looking at music learning theory. So the epistemology is what it is to know something. How do we know what we know? At a philosophical level, what is knowledge? What is knowing? That's a fun, it's a fun context.
It sinks really well into this whole environment of MLT, because Gordon, he was behaviorist, but I largely think that what behaviorists were talking about was correct. They just left out this very crucial piece of the puzzle is that we actually do have conscious experiences. Now, I don't think consciousness is mystical or special or anything, but the behaviorists kind of leave that out. But I mean, in terms of this epistemology of music, like music is an actual conscious experience. It's not music unless it's being consciously perceived by a person. It has to, and that distinction is so important to make because it fits so nicely into the way Gordon talked about, essentially why we have to listen to music before we can audiate it properly. Because the music has to get in the mind somehow. It's like the mind has the grammatical ability to organize music and perceive it, but it still needs perceptual input of like music. You have to listen to sounds to put the content in the mind. But then the mind's ability to actually structure this and organize it and experience it and everything like that.
And then how much of that would happen naturally without, like, how much of it is actually part
innate?
of the genetics, even more than innate, like the genes. Innate.
Sure. I mean, the question here is like, if you take someone whose music aptitude is stabilized, but they never heard music once in their entire life, and you made sure that they never played any rhythm patterns or did anything rhythmic. I mean, this is an evil experiment.
Yeah.
But would they perceive music like eventually properly within a reasonable amount of instruction, or even just in the first listen of it? Because we know with people's eyes, like if someone is blind, like they grow up blind and they have cataracts in their eyes, but the cataracts are removed, so they could be like 8, 9, or 10, never have seen in their life. When they first see, the question is, what do they see? They do not see what you see. They have no sense of depth perception. That actually takes like a half an hour or a couple hours to start being inductively learned. So within a couple hours of just using your eyes, you start naturally developing depth perception because your brain is performing these, again, subconscious logical computations of the sensory data. And so the question is with music is like,
is the wiring already there? How much?
Yeah, I mean, the wiring might be strong enough at a baseline genetic level without any training that some potential is there. So like what we're saying is like, you might have some music aptitude at 15 without ever having listened to music in your life. I don't know. I mean, I don't think we definitely know not training this stuff early is destructive for people, but I don't know how like limited someone could be in this sense.
Yeah, and then how does those same brain structures interpret sound that's language versus music? Because there's overlap for sure. And if you look at
the experiment just got so much more cruel. One group has no language, no music. One group has only music. One group has only language. I mean, no ethics committee would allow this.
The IRB.
I mean, let's just say for pig's sake, it's good that they can't audiate because these experiments would be carried out on them.
Right. But if you look at, the author of A World in Six Songs, and this is your brain on music, his name is escaping me right now.
Levitt?
Daniel Levitin. That if you read those two books, especially A World in Six Songs, you come away with the sense that there had to have been music and art and communication well before language. Like, your frightened response, a vocal frightened response means something, but they didn't have words like, I got scared. They just have,
I agree with you. I agree that music probably existed before basically language and conceptual development, because what we're saying is that music is perceived perceptually, and we could, like, dogs can perceptually perceive things. I mean,
there is no concept until you do have language.
Yeah, exactly. But so it's very likely that like music has taken off since we've gotten more conceptual and our abilities have grown. But there probably was some form of song when language was not very developed. They could have just totally been a one-to-one evolution together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if you're talking about a story, you want to talk about what, that terrible thing that happened. You don't have words to say, and you just go, oh, but you're not being afraid in the moment. You're representing the fear that somebody else showed before they got eaten by the dinosaur.
I mean, that ability you just said, like the ability to like kind of act, like make a sound that you're representing as like taking as a placeholder for some other experience. I mean, that's like kind of the root of language, is being able to. I was listening to this really interesting lecture recently that concept formation occurs at like a perceptual level at first. So like, you hear one chords, you hear rhythm patterns, and then later you give a word to it, and it really solidifies the concept. Like the word is necessary for the concept to kind of fully be formed, because the function of giving a concept a label is that it can now interact and mingle with other pieces of knowledge. But if you don't have the label for it, and this would go for verbal associates in learning theory too, there's no placeholder for the mind to start subconsciously computing things. So you can't change your perception of music without a verbal associate at some level, even if it's a super subjective verbal associate, like one that you just made up on your own, because your mind needs some kind of placeholder to use to do these computations with. Now, the problem is, if you do this at the inappropriate time or the inappropriate way, it doesn't serve as that true placeholder, and just serves as an extra piece of baggage that's not helping the audiation process. Which is like, it's nuts. It's super cool.
Yeah. How many deep holes can I get in today? This is what happens. Well, congratulations, Bo, on being married and having a wonderful trip. I have to just say this publicly, to Europe, and you went to England. I think you should go back, because you come back refreshed and deep.
Yeah, I mean, this is what happens when I have no one to talk to for 2 weeks about learning theory, right? Because like my my wife now, but she understands all this. She's just not interested in this. But it's crazy. Like, she full blown understands all of this stuff just from talking about it. But that's great to hear. I'm glad that it seems like the vacation was helpful, because it was a lot of fun.
You're definitely a different human. Lighter. Yeah.
I mean, that's a good sign, intellectually on, and I feel lighter after the vacation. So that's good.
Anyway, congratulations, and it's wonderful. And
go to London. It's a great time. I happened to be there when the Queen literally was like passing in her, I can't remember the name of the ceremony, but it passed my hotel. And it was quite a surreal experience, but we didn't plan to be there for that, obviously. It was just the timing. So
all right, well, there you go, a little mishmash of stuff. That should be a fun one. Hopefully we'll get some feedback.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. All right, till next time.